Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
Why does her silence stay with him longer than all the love she ever gave? It sounds backwards. You'd think attention would be the thing he remembers. The late-night conversations. The reassurance. The way she kept choosing him, even when he wasn't easy to love. But strangely, months later, it isn't her affection that keeps showing up in his mind. It's the moment she stopped reaching. The day she looked at him without asking for anything. The quiet way she walked away without trying to convince him to stay. Because sometimes, attention feeds the ego. But detachment exposes the parts of us we've spent years hiding from ourselves. And that's a feeling the mind keeps returning to. Even when it desperately wants to forget. He kept saying he needed space. Not dramatically. Not during a huge fight. Just in those small, almost casual ways people use when they're trying to soften what they're really saying. I've just got a lot going on. I'm not really good at this relationship stuff. I just need a little room to think. She nodded every time. At first, she didn't argue. Didn't beg. Didn't throw emotional ultimatums across the room. She simply said, "Okay." At the time, he mistook that for understanding. Looking back, maybe it was the beginning of goodbye. It's strange how we think we know what we want until someone actually gives it to us. He thought space meant fewer conversations. Less emotional responsibility. Less pressure to answer texts immediately. A little more time to breathe. He imagined relief. Instead, he found silence. And silence turned out to be much louder than he expected. The first few days felt almost comfortable. He slept in. Stayed late at work. Watched random videos until 2 a.m. without feeling guilty that he hadn't replied. No one asking where he was. No one wondering why he seemed distant. He even told himself, "See, this is what I needed." He almost believed it. Almost. Because something strange started happening. Not emotionally at first. Physically. His hand kept reaching for his phone. Not consciously. Just automatically. Unlock. Scroll. Lock. 5 minutes later. Unlock again. There wasn't even a message he expected anymore. He wasn't checking because she texted. He was checking because, for months, part of his body had learned that she existed on the other side of that screen. Habits don't disappear just because pride tells them to. His thumb still remembered her. Even after his mind insisted he was fine. One night he opened their chat. Not to send anything. Just to look. He scrolled upward. Stopped at a picture she'd sent weeks ago. A blurry sunset through her windshield. Nothing special. She'd written, "Thought you'd like these colors." At the time he'd simply reacted with a heart emoji. That was it. Now, for some reason, he stared at that photo for almost 10 minutes. Why this one? Why not the vacations? Why not the anniversary? Why this ordinary sunset? Maybe because grief rarely chooses the important moments. It chooses the forgotten ones. He closed the app. Opened it again. Closed it. Opened Instagram. Typed her name. Didn't click it. Deleted the search. Put the phone face down. Picked it up 30 seconds later. It felt embarrassing. Even alone. Especially alone. No. I'm not going to look. Why not? Because she'll think I care. She can't see you searching. That I know. So who are you trying to convince? He didn't answer himself. There was no dramatic heartbreak yet. No tears in the shower. No drinking until sunrise. Just small disturbances. Like the house making unfamiliar sounds after someone moves out. You don't notice them immediately. Then one night you hear the refrigerator humming. The hallway creaks differently. The empty chair suddenly feels visible. That's what her absence became. Visible. He kept telling his friends everything was good. Actually, better than good. I've got my freedom back. They laughed. One of them slapped him on the shoulder. Told you. He laughed too. A little too loudly. Later that night, driving home alone, he realized he'd spent the entire evening checking whether his phone had vibrated. It hadn't. Not once. Funny. He said he wanted less attention. But apparently, his body hadn't agreed to that arrangement. There are moments you don't realize you're emotionally attached until the routine disappears. Maybe she used to send him pictures of her coffee every morning. Maybe she'd ask if he'd eaten. Maybe she'd send a random voice note while walking her dog. Nothing life-changing. Nothing poetic. The kind of things people often take for granted because they happen every day. Until one day, they don't happen. And suddenly the morning feels unfinished. He hated admitting that, because it sounded needy. And he didn't think of himself as needy. He thought needy looked obvious. Clingy. Constant texting. Emotional dependence. This was different. Wasn't it? Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe loneliness sometimes wears expensive watches and answers texts 6 hours later. He became strangely productive. He reorganized his closet. Cleaned the kitchen. Finally fixed the loose cabinet door he'd ignored for months. Went to the gym twice in one day. Worked overtime without anyone asking. People complimented him. You've been crushing it lately. He smiled. Truthfully. He wasn't motivated. He was trying to outrun stillness. Because every quiet moment eventually wandered back to her. Not intentionally. His brain simply stopped having enough distractions. He'd be standing in the grocery store deciding between 2 brands of pasta. And suddenly remember the ridiculous way she'd pronounce Parmesan, just to make him laugh. He'd hear someone wearing the same perfume. Not exactly the same. Just close enough. His shoulders would tense before his mind even recognized why. The body notices first. It always notices first. One evening he almost texted her. Not because he had something important to say. Actually, he had nothing to say. That was the problem. He typed. Hope you're doing okay. Deleted it. Typed. Saw something that reminded me of you. Deleted that too. Finally he just stared at the blinking cursor. How strange. When she was around, words sometimes felt unnecessary. Now there were thousands of them. None felt safe enough to send. Do you miss her? No. Really? I miss talking. To anyone? No. Sometimes honesty arrives in pieces. Not all at once. The hardest part wasn't losing conversations. It was realizing she had quietly become part of the architecture of his everyday life. He never noticed while she was there. That's how familiarity works. You stop seeing it. Like the sound of the ceiling fan. Or the smell of your own home. Until it disappears. Then suddenly, everything feels unfamiliar. He remembered one evening months earlier. They'd been sitting in complete silence. She was reading. He was pretending to watch television while actually scrolling through emails. No deep conversation. No declarations of love. She reached over without looking and rested her foot against his leg. That was all. Barely 5 seconds. He didn't even react. Now, for reasons he couldn't explain, that tiny gesture hurt more than any argument they'd ever had. Maybe because ordinary intimacy leaves deeper fingerprints than dramatic romance. No orchestra. No movie soundtrack. Just someone's foot finding yours without thinking. He started sleeping on one side of the bed. Not because she had ever lived there permanently. She hadn't. But she'd spent enough nights there that the other side had become imagined. Funny how imagination leaves physical space behind. He wondered if she was okay, then immediately became irritated with himself for wondering. What difference does it make? It doesn't. So stop thinking. Okay. 5 minutes later. I wonder if she's sleeping. He wasn't falling apart. That's the thing people misunderstand. Most men don't always collapse in obvious ways. Sometimes they become quieter, more sarcastic, more productive, more unavailable. Sometimes they convince everyone, including themselves, that they're doing better, while slowly becoming strangers to their own emotions. He wasn't crying over her. He was becoming harder to reach, even by people who had nothing to do with her. And somewhere inside that growing silence, a realization began forming. Small, uncomfortable, still incomplete. Maybe he hadn't actually wanted space. Maybe he had wanted reassurance without vulnerability, freedom without consequence, distance that still guaranteed she'd be there when he turned around. But real space doesn't work like that. Real space keeps expanding. Until one day, you look back expecting to see someone waiting, and they're simply living their life, without asking whether you're ready, without asking whether you've figured yourself out, without asking if you've finally decided. That's the moment the word space changes its meaning. It stops feeling like relief, and starts feeling like loss. Not because she punished him, not because she played games, but because she quietly accepted the distance he asked for. And for the first time, he had to experience exactly what he'd been requesting all along. There's something almost unfair about the way memory works. You would think we'd remember the biggest moments. The first kiss, the worst argument, the night someone cried, the last goodbye. But that's rarely what stays. Instead, the mind gets stuck on things that never reached an ending. A sentence interrupted. A hug that felt shorter than usual. A message someone almost sent. An ordinary Tuesday that suddenly became the last ordinary Tuesday without anyone realizing it. That's what her detachment became. Not loud enough to be called rejection. Not dramatic enough to be called abandonment. Just unfinished. And unfinished things have a strange way of refusing to leave us alone. When she was still giving him attention, he barely noticed how constant it was. She'd ask about his meeting. She'd remember the name of his coworker. She'd notice when his voice sounded different. Sometimes she'd send him a picture of the sky. Sometimes it was just a song. Sometimes nothing more than drive safely. Tiny things. The kind of things people almost never appreciate while they're happening. Because consistency becomes invisible. It's like living next to the ocean. The waves are loud on the first day. 6 months later, you barely hear them. Until they're gone. Then suddenly, the silence sounds wrong. He didn't stop appreciating her because she became less valuable. He stopped noticing because the human brain quietly adapts to safety. It's uncomfortable to admit. But people often become most blind to the love they receive every day. Not intentionally. Just gradually. Attention becomes expected. Expected becomes normal. Normal becomes background noise. Background noise disappears. Until one day. It doesn't. He remembered a conversation that had seemed meaningless at the time. She had called him after work. Not because anything happened. She was just walking through the grocery store. I can't decide if I should buy strawberries. He laughed. You called me for that? No. A pause. I just wanted to hear your voice. He smiled. Made a joke. Changed the subject. At the time it felt almost too simple. Now he would have given anything to hear her asking about strawberries again. Funny. The moments we dismiss are often the ones grief chooses to preserve. He used to answer her messages whenever it was convenient. Sometimes 10 minutes later. Sometimes 3 hours. Occasionally the next morning. She almost always replied, almost always stayed emotionally available. There was something comforting about that. Comfortable enough that he stopped questioning whether she'd always be there. Not because he was arrogant. Because certainty quietly makes people careless. He wasn't trying to hurt her. He simply believed tomorrow would look exactly like today. Most people do. Until tomorrow changes. The strange thing about detachment. It doesn't immediately feel painful. At first it feels confusing. The messages become shorter. She still responds. But something invisible has shifted. There's no complaint. No accusation. No emotional confrontation. Just less. Less curiosity. Less reaching. Less warmth tucked between ordinary sentences. He noticed it, then immediately talked himself out of noticing it. She's probably just busy. Everyone has stressful weeks. Don't overthink it. Maybe he was right. Maybe he wasn't. Either way, his stomach had already noticed before his thoughts caught up. One evening she answered with only 3 words. Hope you're okay. That was it. No follow-up question. No smiley face she usually added. No. Tell me how it went. Nothing. He stared at those 3 words much longer than he cared to admit. Why? Objectively. Nothing was wrong. People send short messages every day. But emotionally, something felt missing. Not in the words. Behind them. He almost replied immediately. Then stopped himself. No. If she's pulling back, I should pull back too. It felt childish. He knew it. But hurt people often choose strategy over honesty. Not because strategy works. Because vulnerability suddenly feels expensive. The conversation ended there. Neither of them officially left. Neither of them officially stayed. Just silence. That's the problem with unfinished endings. Your brain keeps trying to finish them. Weeks later, he'd still replay tiny exchanges. Did she sound tired? Or disappointed? Was she waiting for him to ask another question? Should he have called instead of texting? Was there a moment he missed? Memory isn't objective. It's an editor. It cuts scenes. Repeats others. Adds music where there wasn't any. Removes context. And somehow convinces you the new version is reality. At 2 a.m, his mind became a courtroom. I didn't do anything wrong. No. But did you do enough? I don't know. There it was again. That answer. I don't know. Not because he lacked intelligence. Because emotional hindsight arrives with information we didn't have at the time. That's what makes regret so cruel. It judges yesterday using today's awareness. He remembered the last dinner they shared. Nothing dramatic happened. She laughed. He laughed. They talked about work. The waiter accidentally brought the wrong drink. She teased him for always ordering the same meal. He rolled his eyes. Normal. Completely normal. Looking back, he kept asking himself one ridiculous question. Did she already know? Did she already know she was getting tired? Was she already quietly letting go while he was discussing appetizers? There's no answer. But the mind loves impossible questions. Especially after loss. He started revisiting conversations the way people revisit old neighborhoods. Looking for evidence. Looking for signs. Looking for some invisible clue that would make the ending make sense. There usually wasn't one. Life rarely leaves neat explanations. One afternoon, he accidentally found himself smiling. He'd forgotten about her for almost 3 hours. Then guilt appeared. Not because he forgot. Because he noticed he'd forgotten. Grief is strange. Sometimes healing feels like betrayal. He caught himself reaching for his phone whenever something funny happened. A dog wearing tiny boots. A terrible billboard. A song from years ago. His first instinct was still. I should send this to Then reality quietly finished the sentence. No one. That tiny interruption hurt far more than he expected. There are relationships that end loudly. Doors slam. Voices rise. People block each other. Those endings are painful. But at least they have shape. This was different. This ending dissolved. Like fog. No clear moment. No obvious villain. Just two people becoming slightly less present every week. Until one day, the distance had become too large to casually walk across. He kept expecting one more conversation. One final explanation. One emotional closing scene where everything would suddenly make sense. Life rarely offers that. Sometimes the last conversation is about groceries. Or traffic. Or reminding someone to bring a jacket. And neither of you knows. That's the ending. Maybe she's waiting for me. Maybe. So text her. Why aren't you? What if she doesn't want that anymore? And if she does? Silence again. Sometimes fear sounds exactly like logic. He wondered if she ever replayed these moments too. Then immediately stopped himself. Because there was no answer. The human mind hates unanswered questions. But unanswered questions survive longer than answered ones. Maybe that's why detachment feels addictive. Not because it feels good. Because uncertainty keeps demanding another thought. Another replay. Another imaginary version where things turned out differently. Months later, someone asked him what he missed most. He almost answered. Her. But that wasn't completely true. He missed certainty. He missed reaching for his phone without hesitation. He missed assuming tomorrow would include her. He missed not realizing he could lose something so ordinary. Because ordinary things don't feel precious. Until they become impossible to experience again. That's why her attention slowly disappeared from memory. Attention had become familiar. Predictable. Safe. His mind accepted it. Filed it away. But her detachment. Her quiet withdrawal. Her unanswered warmth. Her unfinished goodbye. His brain never found a place to store those. So it kept opening the file. Again. And again. And again. Not because he enjoyed remembering. But because the story inside him never felt complete. And maybe that's one of the most painfully human truths about love. We often survive what ended. What quietly follows us for years. Is everything that never really had the chance to finish. At first, the silence felt empty. Then slowly, it began to sound like her. Not literally. He wasn't hearing voices. He wasn't imagining impossible things. It was something much quieter than that. Something almost impossible to explain unless you've lived through it yourself. Because silence doesn't stay silent forever. Eventually, it starts translating everything you've been avoiding. The first week after she stopped reaching out, the quiet felt peaceful. By the third week, it had become crowded. Not with conversations. With memories. The strange thing about memory is that it doesn't ask permission. It simply arrives. You're brushing your teeth. There she is. You're waiting at a red light. There she is again. You're halfway through an email at work. Suddenly you're remembering the exact way she used to pronounce your name when she was tired. Nothing dramatic. Nothing important. Just fragments. Tiny emotional fingerprints hiding inside ordinary moments. He realized something one Tuesday morning. He hadn't turned on the television. He hadn't played music. He hadn't opened YouTube. The apartment was completely quiet. Months earlier, that kind of silence would have felt relaxing. Now, it almost felt aggressive. Like the room itself was waiting for him to admit something. So he grabbed the remote. Turned on the television. Didn't watch it. He just needed noise. Not entertainment. Noise. Because noise gave his thoughts somewhere else to go. Silence always brought them back to her. People often think missing someone means constantly thinking about them. It doesn't. Sometimes it's much stranger. You can spend hours without consciously remembering them. Then someone laughs the way they laughed. Or a cashier says the same phrase they always used. Or you see their favorite snack sitting on a shelf. And suddenly, an entire emotional world returns in less than 2 seconds. That's what surprised him. Not how often he thought about her. How little it took. He was walking through the grocery store when he reached for a jar of pasta sauce. He froze. She had once spent almost 10 minutes insisting that a different brand tasted better. He'd teased her for caring so much about something so small. She laughed. "One day you'll thank me." At the time, he rolled his eyes. Now, standing alone in aisle 7, he bought her favorite brand. Not because he suddenly preferred it, because for one strange second, it felt like choosing her. He got home, opened the jar, stopped. "What are you doing?" There was no answer. The sauce tasted exactly the same as every other sauce. That had never been the point. The silence had started changing ordinary objects into emotional evidence. The coffee mug she liked. The blanket she always stole. The side of the couch where she'd curl up without asking. None of these things hurt while she was there. Now they all seemed louder than they should. Not because objects remember people. Because people attach stories to objects. And stories don't disappear when someone leaves. He found himself driving different routes home. Not intentionally. Just avoiding streets. There was one coffee shop they visited almost every Saturday. Another intersection where they'd once argued over absolutely nothing. A bookstore where she'd spent 40 minutes browsing while he pretended to be impatient. He drove around all of them. Then one afternoon, he accidentally ended up on the old route. His chest tightened before his brain even realized where he was. That's the strange thing about the nervous system. It keeps maps the mind forgets. He laughed less. Not because life wasn't funny. Because there was no one who understood why certain things were funny. Everyone has a private language with the people they love. Inside jokes. Shared expressions. Words that make absolutely no sense to anyone else. Those languages don't die overnight. They become homeless. He'd hear something ridiculous and instinctively think. She'd laugh at this. Then remember. There was nowhere to send it anymore. One evening his phone buzzed. His heart reacted instantly. Too quickly. Faster than thought. He picked it up. Unknown number. Spam. He almost laughed at himself. Almost. Instead he sat there wondering why one tiny vibration still carried so much hope. Hope can survive long after logic has packed its bags. His friends invited him out more often. "Come on. You've been disappearing." He went. He smiled. He told stories. He even laughed. People assumed he was getting better. Maybe he assumed that too. Until he got into his car afterward. Silence again. The mask always comes off in empty parking lots. He noticed something embarrassing. He had started talking out loud to himself. Not entire conversations. Just little sentences. "I forgot the milk. That guy can't drive. I should call." Then the sentence stopped. He realized he used to say those things to her. Not because they mattered. Because sharing tiny moments is one of the quiet ways people build intimacy. Without someone to receive those thoughts, they simply echoed back. At night, the apartment sounded different. The refrigerator clicked. The air conditioner hummed. A neighbor upstairs dropped something. Every sound felt unusually sharp. Not because the building had changed. Because there were fewer conversations filling the spaces between those sounds. He finally understood why some people sleep with podcasts playing. Not because they're interested. Because voices can temporarily convince loneliness to wait outside. There was one song he refused to play. Not because it was their song. It wasn't. It had simply been playing during a road trip months ago. She had fallen asleep in the passenger seat. Her head leaned gently against the window. The afternoon sunlight kept moving across her face. Nothing happened. No declarations. No dramatic scene. Just miles of highway and comfortable silence. That memory somehow became impossible to touch. So he skipped the song every time it appeared. Until one day, he didn't skip it quickly enough. The first note played. His hands tightened around the steering wheel. He almost changed it. Instead, he listened. All 4 minutes. When it ended, he realized something. The song wasn't hurting him. The version of himself inside that memory was. Because that man had no idea how temporary everything was. Memory is cruel in that way. It lets you revisit places while stripping away the innocence you had when you first lived them. He began waking up around 3 in the morning. Not every night. Just often enough to notice. His mind would immediately start searching for something. No. Someone. He reached for his phone almost automatically. Nothing. He'd lock the screen. Close his eyes. Then his brain would begin manufacturing conversations. What if I'd called? What if I'd apologized sooner? What if I'd simply asked how she was feeling? Questions with no destination. Only repetition. Psychologists sometimes describe this as unfinished emotional processing. But living through it doesn't feel clinical. It feels like standing in front of a door that no longer exists. Still trying to knock. He kept expecting time to erase her. Instead, time changed her. She stopped feeling like a real person in his daily life. She became something stranger. A voice inside his habits. A ghost inside routines. Not haunting him. Following him. Quietly. Then one afternoon something unexpected happened. He couldn't remember the sound of her laugh. He tried. He really tried. He remembered that she laughed. He remembered how it made him feel. But the actual sound. It wouldn't come. Panic arrived immediately. No. He searched old videos. Found one. Pressed play. There it was. Her laugh. Exactly as it had always been. He smiled. Then, without warning, his eyes filled with tears. Not because he had found it. Because he had almost lost it. That's when he understood something terrifying. Silence doesn't only preserve memories. Eventually, it starts erasing them too. One detail at a time. A voice. A facial expression. The exact color of someone's eyes in the afternoon. Little pieces disappear so slowly you don't notice until they're already gone. He realized he wasn't afraid of never seeing her again. Not entirely. He was afraid of forgetting her. Or maybe, he was afraid she would eventually forget him first. Those are 2 very different fears. One evening he stood by the kitchen window watching rain slide down the glass. Months ago, he would have texted her. It's raining again. She probably would have answered with a picture from wherever she was. Or complained about forgetting an umbrella. Or made some terrible joke. Now, the rain simply existed. Beautiful. Quiet. Shared with no one. And that's when the silence said something he had spent months trying not to hear. It whispered a truth so small that he almost missed it. He hadn't only lost her presence. He had lost the version of everyday life that existed because someone else was there to witness it. Because that's what love quietly does. It doesn't just give us another person. It gives ordinary moments somewhere to belong. And when that person leaves, the world doesn't become less beautiful. The sunsets still happen. The rain still falls. Coffee still tastes like coffee. Songs still play on the radio. But for a while, everything beautiful feels strangely unfinished. Not because beauty disappeared. Because there is no longer someone standing beside you. Silently saying, "Did you see that too?" There is a strange paradox in human relationships. The harder someone chases, the more we assume they'll always keep running. The moment they stop, we become the one who can't stand still. He never expected that to happen. If someone had asked him months earlier whether her silence would consume so much of his attention, he probably would have laughed. "I'll be fine. I've always been independent. I know how to move on." He believed every word. Because confidence is easiest before reality arrives. For a long time, he misunderstood attachment. He thought attachment meant needing someone every minute. Constant texting. Constant reassurance. Constant closeness. But that's rarely how attachment reveals itself. Real attachment often hides inside certainty. The certainty that someone will answer. The certainty they'll smile when you walk into the room. The certainty tomorrow will look like today. You don't realize how attached you've become until certainty quietly disappears. She didn't make a dramatic announcement. She didn't post cryptic messages. She didn't try to make him jealous. She simply continued living. That was the part he struggled to understand. She wasn't trying to punish him. She wasn't performing distance. She was simply no longer organizing her emotional world around him. And somehow, that hurt more than anger ever could. Because anger still points toward someone. Indifference points somewhere else. The first time he saw a new photo of her online, he stared at it far longer than he intended. She looked normal. That almost offended him. She wasn't crying. She wasn't trying to look stronger than she felt. She wasn't pretending to be happy. She simply looked peaceful. He zoomed in for reasons he couldn't explain. Was that the same sweater? Had she cut her hair? Who took the picture? Where was she? Who was standing just outside the frame? His mind immediately started building stories from almost no information. Because uncertainty always recruits imagination. He closed the app. Opened it again 10 minutes later. Closed it. Opened it that evening. He wasn't checking on her anymore. He was checking on his place in her life. Those are very different things. Days passed. Then weeks. He noticed something uncomfortable. She wasn't reaching out. Not because she was waiting for him. Not because she wanted him to notice. She simply wasn't. That absence slowly became impossible to ignore. At first he called it pride. Then timing. Then misunderstanding. Eventually, he had to consider another possibility. Maybe she had actually accepted the ending. Acceptance is difficult to witness when you're still negotiating with the past. Because internally, he wasn't living in the present. He was constantly editing history. Maybe if he had stayed 5 minutes longer that night. Maybe if he'd asked one more question. Maybe if he had admitted he was afraid instead of pretending everything was fine. His mind treated the past like unfinished clay. Always reshaping. Never satisfied. Reality never changed. Only the story inside his head did. One afternoon he found an old notebook while cleaning a drawer. Inside were random grocery lists. Phone numbers. Work notes. Then, one page stopped him. It wasn't important. Just a list they had made together before a weekend trip. Coffee. Sunscreen. Snacks. Phone charger. Extra blanket. She had added a tiny smiley face beside the word coffee. He smiled before he realized he was smiling. Then the smile slowly disappeared. Because grief often arrives disguised as gratitude. The memory wasn't painful because it had been bad. It was painful because it had been good. He sat there holding that notebook much longer than necessary. Eventually he asked himself something he had successfully avoided for months. When did I stop paying attention? Not when she left. Long before that. When had her effort become invisible? When had her consistency become background noise? When had he started assuming love would always refill itself? There wasn't one answer. Just dozens of tiny moments. Love rarely dies because of one catastrophe. More often, it slowly runs out of places to land. He remembered how often she had tried to understand him. She noticed when he withdrew after stressful days. She learned which jokes meant he was actually overwhelmed. She knew when silence meant peace. And when silence meant he was carrying something alone. At the time, he appreciated it. At least he thought he did. Looking back, he wondered how often appreciation stayed inside his head instead of reaching her heart. Because unspoken gratitude feels exactly like indifference to the person waiting to hear it. There was one conversation he couldn't stop replaying. She had once asked him, "Do you ever think about losing people?" He laughed. "That's a depressing question." She smiled. "I know." Then quietly added, "I think about it sometimes." He changed the subject. Not because he didn't care. Because discomfort has a remarkable ability to disguise itself as optimism. Now, months later, he wished he had stayed inside that conversation. Sometimes the questions people ask aren't really questions. They're invitations. And invitations expire. He finally admitted something to himself. He hadn't lost her in one day. He had slowly stopped seeing the emotional labor she carried. The remembering. The checking in. The noticing. The forgiving. The reaching. None of those actions demanded applause. But they did deserve recognition. Recognition that arrived too late. One evening he sat alone on his balcony as the city lights flickered awake. For months he had been asking the wrong question. Why can't I stop thinking about her? Maybe that wasn't the real mystery. Maybe the better question was, what exactly am I missing? Was it her? Partly. Was it loneliness? Sometimes. Was it guilt? Definitely. But beneath all of that, there was something even deeper. He missed being deeply known. She had remembered the version of him that existed beneath performance. The tired version. The insecure version. The ambitious version. The little boy hiding behind the confident man. Being understood is addictive. You only realize how rare it is after it's gone. That's why every attempt to replace her felt strangely empty. He met new people. Interesting people. Kind people. Beautiful people. None of them were wrong. But conversations felt lighter. Polite. Surface level. Not because those people lacked depth. Because depth takes time. Years of accumulated observations. Thousands of ordinary moments. Love isn't built from grand gestures. It's built from someone remembering how you take your coffee without asking. Remembering which story you've already told. Recognizing your fake smile before you've finished putting it on. No one else knew those things yet. And suddenly, he understood how irreplaceable familiarity can become. Weeks later, something changed. Not outside. Inside. He stopped opening her profile every day. Then every week. Then only occasionally. Not because he no longer cared. Because exhaustion finally began replacing obsession. The mind cannot sustain emergency forever. Eventually, it starts surrendering. Not out of strength. Out of survival. Healing is quieter than heartbreak. Nobody notices the first morning you don't immediately think about them. Nobody applauds the first song you finish without skipping. Nobody celebrates the first weekend you genuinely laugh without comparing it to the past. Those victories happen invisibly. One ordinary day at a time. Then something unexpected happened. He remembered her. Without immediately hurting. That frightened him. For a second, he wondered if forgetting had begun. But it wasn't forgetting. It was transformation. Memories had stopped feeling like open wounds. They had started feeling like photographs. Still meaningful. No longer bleeding. He realized something she had understood long before he did. Letting go isn't the opposite of love. Sometimes, it's the final expression of it. She had stopped forcing herself into a place where she no longer felt fully chosen. Not because she loved him less. Because she had finally decided to love herself enough to stop begging for certainty. That realization humbled him. Not because it made him feel guilty. Because it made him grow. Months earlier, he had believed her silence was a strategy. Now he understood it had been acceptance. There is an enormous difference. One is trying to control another person. The other is reclaiming yourself. Looking back, he could finally see the invisible shift. The more she stopped chasing, the more space appeared inside him. Space where denial used to live. Space where distraction used to hide. Space where his own emotional truth finally had room to speak. Ironically, he became emotionally available only after there was no longer anyone asking him to be. Life has a painful sense of timing sometimes. If he could speak to the version of himself from a year ago, he wouldn't tell him to fight harder. He wouldn't tell him to send more messages. He wouldn't even tell him how everything would end. He would simply say, "Fais attention." Notice the ordinary conversations. Notice the tiny acts of care. Notice how often someone chooses you without announcing it. Don't wait until silence teaches you the value of a voice you once heard every day. Because love rarely disappears all at once. It quietly asks to be noticed. Long before it asks to be mourned. And perhaps that's why her detachment became so unforgettable. Not because distance is more powerful than affection, but because her quiet absence forced him to recognize everything her quiet presence had been carrying all along. In the end, he finally understood the lesson he had spent months resisting. She didn't become unforgettable because she left. She became unforgettable because only after she stopped holding on did he finally understand what it had felt like to be held. There is one final truth that almost no one wants to admit. Sometimes, we don't fully understand what someone meant to us until they stop trying to prove it. Not because they suddenly became more valuable. Because our perception finally caught up with reality. Love had been there all along. Our attention hadn't. He spent months believing he missed her. Eventually, he realized that wasn't entirely true. He missed who he had become when she was there. There is a difference. One is longing for another person. The other is grieving a version of yourself that only existed inside that relationship. With her, he had been softer, less guarded, more spontaneous. He complained more openly. He laughed more freely. He wasn't constantly measuring every word before speaking. He had forgotten that version of himself even existed. Until she disappeared. People often say that absence makes the heart grow fonder. But that's only part of the story. Absence doesn't create value. Absence removes distraction. While someone is present, we become accustomed to them. Our attention scatters across work, bills, deadlines, notifications, appointments. The relationship quietly becomes part of the furniture of life. Comfortable, reliable, almost invisible. Then one day, the furniture is gone. Suddenly every empty corner demands your attention. Not because the room changed overnight. Because you finally noticed what had always been holding it together. He thought about something strange. When she loved him openly, he had choices. He could answer later. He could become distracted. He could assume tomorrow would give him another opportunity. Love felt abundant. And abundance often tricks the human mind into believing something is permanent. But detachment offers no future promises. It quietly says, "This may be the last version of me you'll ever know." Scarcity changes the brain. Psychologists have observed it for years. We pay more attention to what appears limited than to what feels guaranteed. Maybe that's why her silence became louder than all of her words. One evening, while walking home from work, he noticed an elderly couple sitting on a park bench. Neither of them was speaking. The woman simply leaned her head against the man's shoulder. He looked down at her, smiled, then returned to watching the sunset. Nothing dramatic happened. No declarations. No movie soundtrack. Just two people sharing an ordinary silence. For some reason, his chest tightened. Because he finally understood something he had never appreciated before. Real intimacy eventually becomes quiet. It isn't built on excitement forever. It's built on familiarity. On choosing the same person during thousands of uneventful evenings. And perhaps, that was exactly what he had mistaken for ordinary. He remembered how often she simply wanted his attention. Not expensive gifts. Not elaborate plans. Just presence. She would tell him about something that happened at work. He'd nod while checking his phone. She would point out a beautiful sunset. He'd glance for half a second before returning to whatever occupied his mind. She never demanded perfection. She only wanted to feel that her moments mattered to someone else. Looking back, he realized how many opportunities had quietly passed between them without either one saying a word. There is a painful illusion many people carry. They assume love disappears because feelings fade. Sometimes, love disappears because attention fades first. Feelings often follow. She hadn't left because she woke up one morning without love. She left because carrying love alone had become exhausting. There's a difference. One happens inside the heart. The other happens inside hope. He began reading about attachment. Not to fix anything. There was nothing left to fix. He simply wanted to understand why his mind refused to let go. One sentence stayed with him. The brain becomes especially attached to rewards that arrive unpredictably. He closed the book. That wasn't exactly his situation. Then he thought longer. Maybe it was. Because near the end, her warmth had become unpredictable. Not because she was playing games. Because she was slowly protecting herself. Some days she still reached for him. Other days she didn't. His brain began searching constantly for signs. One affectionate message. One warm smile. One small indication that everything was okay. Without realizing it, he had become emotionally dependent on uncertainty. And uncertainty is addictive. Not because it feels good. Because the mind hates unanswered questions. That's why her detachment lingered longer than her affection. Affection had been understandable. Predictable. Comfortable. Detachment felt like a puzzle with missing pieces. The human mind rarely obsesses over completed stories. It obsesses over interrupted ones. Months continued passing. Life slowly became recognizable again. Work filled his weekdays. Friends returned. Family conversations became easier. He slept through most nights. He laughed without forcing it. He smiled at strangers again. From the outside, he looked completely healed. Inside, something quieter had changed. He no longer wanted her back simply to stop hurting. That desire had disappeared. Instead, he wanted to thank her. Not because everything had been beautiful. It hadn't. Not because she had been perfect. She wasn't. But because losing her had forced him to meet parts of himself he had ignored for years. His emotional avoidance. His fear of vulnerability. His habit of assuming tomorrow was guaranteed. Pain had become a teacher he never would have chosen voluntarily. One afternoon, nearly a year later, he passed someone who looked remarkably like her. The same walk. The same hairstyle. The same jacket. His heart reacted instantly. Then the woman turned around. A stranger. He smiled at himself. The reaction surprised him. Not because his heart still recognized familiar shapes. Because it no longer broke when it was wrong. There had been a time when moments like that ruined entire days. Now, they simply reminded him that healing doesn't erase memory. It changes your relationship with it. He wondered sometimes whether she ever thought about him. The question still appeared from time to time. But it no longer demanded an answer. That was new. Months earlier. Not knowing had tortured him. Now, he understood something important. Whether she remembered him or not no longer determined the value of what they had shared. Memory isn't validated by reciprocity. Some people remain important even if they never think about us again. That doesn't make the experience less real. One evening, he found the old coffee mug she used whenever she visited. It had somehow survived every cleaning session, every attempt to reorganize the kitchen. He picked it up, turned it over in his hands. For a long moment, he simply looked at it. Then he placed it back inside the cabinet. Not hidden, not displayed, just where it belonged. That tiny action felt strangely symbolic. He wasn't throwing away the past. He also wasn't living inside it anymore. The memory had finally found its proper shelf. Perhaps that is what real closure actually looks like. Not forgetting. Not replacing. Not pretending someone never mattered. Closure is allowing the past to become part of your story without demanding that it remain your present. It is remembering someone with tenderness instead of urgency, with gratitude instead of negotiation, with peace instead of desperation. If he could describe everything he had learned in one sentence, it would be surprisingly simple. People rarely miss what someone gave them. They miss how that person quietly changed the emotional climate of their everyday life. The morning messages, the casual check-ins, the familiar voice after difficult days, the certainty that someone knew where they were emotionally without needing a long explanation. Those things don't seem extraordinary while they're happening. They become extraordinary only after silence replaces them. That is why her detachment felt more addictive than her attention. Not because distance is more attractive than love. Not because mystery is stronger than intimacy. And certainly not because emotional withdrawal is something to imitate. It was because her absence forced him to consciously search for what her presence had once provided effortlessly. Love had asked for almost nothing except awareness. Detachment demanded endless interpretation. One nourished the heart. The other trapped the mind. Looking back, he realized the greatest misunderstanding had never been about her. It had been about time. He had believed love could always wait. That appreciation could be expressed tomorrow. That difficult conversations could happen next week. That people who loved us deeply would simply continue loving us while we figured ourselves out. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they can't. Because even the most patient heart eventually grows tired of knocking on a door that never fully opens. And maybe that is the quiet tragedy hidden inside so many relationships. No one intended to hurt the other. No one woke up planning to drift apart. Life simply became louder than the small moments asking for attention. Until one person finally became silent. Only then did the other hear everything that silence had been trying to say. So if there is one thought worth carrying away from this story, perhaps it is this. Pay attention while love is still speaking in an ordinary voice. Notice the person who remembers your coffee order. The one who asks how your meeting went because they genuinely remembered it mattered. The one who sends you a picture of the sky simply because they thought you'd like to see it. Those moments rarely announce themselves as important. They simply accumulate. Quietly. Patiently. Until one day they become the architecture of a life shared with another person. And if that person ever walks away, you may discover, as he did, that what haunts us most is not the grand romance we lost. It is the countless ordinary moments we assumed would always be there. Because in the end, love was never most powerful when she was chasing him. It was most powerful in all the quiet ways she had already chosen him. Long before he realized how extraordinary those ordinary choices truly were. There is a painful irony that lives inside many endings. Sometimes, the deepest love arrives too late. Not because love itself was late. Because awareness was. For the longest time, he believed love was something you felt. A feeling. An emotion. A spark. Something that appeared naturally when the right person came along. But after everything had fallen apart, he began questioning that idea. Maybe love wasn't only something you felt. Maybe it was also something you noticed. And noticing required presence. He remembered one afternoon near the end of their relationship. She had been talking about her day. Nothing extraordinary had happened. A difficult coworker. A funny mistake at lunch. A phone call from her mother. He listened. Or at least he thought he did. His responses were automatic. MHM. Really? That's crazy. His eyes never completely left the screen in front of him. She eventually stopped talking. At the time, he didn't even realize she had become quiet. Now, years later, he could remember the exact expression on her face when she gave up trying to include him in that conversation. Funny how memory works. It rarely preserves the moments we celebrate. It preserves the moments we wish we had understood differently. There is a kind of loneliness that exists inside relationships. Not because two people stop loving each other. Because one person slowly begins feeling unseen. Being physically present isn't the same as being emotionally available. You can sit beside someone every evening and still leave them feeling completely alone. He hadn't understood that. He thought providing stability was enough. He worked. He answered when necessary. He came home. He didn't cheat. He didn't yell. In his mind, he was doing everything a good partner should do. But relationships aren't sustained by the absence of cruelty. They're sustained by the presence of attention. That realization unsettled him. Because he had spent months asking himself where everything went wrong. Now he saw that sometimes nothing dramatic goes wrong. People simply stop making each other feel deeply accompanied. She had once told him something that made no sense at the time. I don't need you to solve everything. I just want to feel like you're here with me. He remembered nodding. He remembered believing he understood. He hadn't. He interpreted her words as another emotional request. Another conversation to postpone until life became less busy. Life never became less busy. Instead, she became quieter. Quietness is often misunderstood. People assume silence means peace. Sometimes silence is simply hope becoming tired. There comes a moment when explaining yourself begins to feel heavier than carrying your disappointment alone. That was the silence she eventually entered. Not because she had nothing left to say. Because she no longer believed saying it would change anything. Months after the breakup, he found himself thinking less about the ending. And more about the middle. That surprised him. The arguments became blurry. The goodbye became less vivid. Instead, ordinary Tuesday evenings returned. The grocery store. Cooking dinner together. Laughing because they couldn't decide what movie to watch. Her sitting cross-legged on the couch reading while he worked. Those moments resurfaced with incredible clarity. Not because they were extraordinary. Because they had been home. He finally understood why memories had shifted. At first, grief focuses on loss. Eventually, it begins revealing value. In the beginning, all he could think about was the day she left. Now, he thought about the hundreds of days she stayed. Those days mattered far more. One evening, while cleaning old folders on his laptop, he discovered a short video he didn't remember recording. It lasted only 18 seconds. She was making coffee in the kitchen. She noticed him filming. Rolled her eyes. Smiled. Then laughed because she almost dropped the spoon. Nothing happened. No speech. No romance. Just 18 ordinary seconds. He watched it once. Then again. Then again. Not because something important occurred. Because ordinary moments become priceless after they stop existing. He suddenly realized something almost unbearable. At the time he recorded that video, he probably forgot about it within an hour. Now, he would have given anything to step back into those 18 seconds. Not to change the future. Just to pay full attention. Regret often sounds like wishing you had chosen differently. But sometimes regret is quieter. Sometimes regret simply whispers, "I wish I had been more awake while it was happening." As time passed, he noticed another change inside himself. People around him began opening up. Friends told him about failing marriages. Co-workers admitted they felt disconnected from their families. His younger brother confessed he wasn't sure his relationship would last. For the first time, he didn't rush to offer solutions. Instead, he listened. Really listened. He asked questions. He stayed curious. He resisted the urge to fix everything immediately. And something remarkable happened. People kept talking. He wondered if this was what she had wanted from him all along. Not perfection. Presence. Presence sounds simple. It isn't. Presence asks us to temporarily set down our own thoughts, our own distractions, our own need to prepare the next response. Presence says, "For this moment, your experience matters as much as mine." That kind of attention feels rare, which is why losing someone who gave it freely feels almost impossible to replace. Sometimes he imagined running into her years later. Not to get back together. Not to undo the past. Just to see whether life had been kind to her. In those imagined conversations, he never tried to explain himself anymore. Earlier fantasies had been different. He used to imagine convincing her. Apologizing perfectly. Finding the right words that would somehow rewrite history. Now, his imaginary conversations were much quieter. He simply wanted to say, "I understand now." Not because understanding changes what happened. Because some lessons deserve to be spoken aloud. Even when they arrived too late. One autumn afternoon, he walked through a bookstore. A young couple stood nearby, arguing softly. The woman stopped talking. The man continued explaining why he was right. She wasn't angry anymore. She just looked tired. He recognized that expression immediately. It was the same look she had worn during the final months. Not rage. Not resentment. Fatigue. The exhaustion of feeling unheard. He almost wanted to interrupt. To tell the man, "Stop explaining for 1 minute. Ask her what she's carrying. Stay there. Don't defend yourself yet." Of course. He said nothing. Life rarely gives us permission to rewrite someone else's story. We can only recognize pieces of our own. Healing had changed him in ways he never expected. He no longer admired emotional distance. He no longer believed vulnerability made people weak. He no longer interpreted tenderness as dependency. Instead, he began seeing courage differently. Perhaps courage wasn't remaining untouched by love. Perhaps courage was allowing another human being to matter enough that their inner world became important to you. Not as a responsibility. As a privilege. He often thought about the phrase, "People come into your life for a reason." He wasn't sure he believed it. Life seemed too complicated for simple explanations. But he did believe something else. Some people leave carrying pieces of ourselves we didn't know they were holding. Not because they stole them. Because they reflected them. She reflected patience he hadn't appreciated. Kindness he had overlooked. Gentleness he mistook for permanence. When she left, those reflections disappeared. Only then did he begin searching for them within himself. The strange thing about maturity is that it rarely feels triumphant. It often feels like grief. Because becoming wiser usually means realizing how differently you would have loved if only you had known then what you know now. There is humility inside that realization. Not self-hatred. Just honesty. Eventually, he stopped asking whether she had been the one. The question no longer mattered. Some people become permanent chapters regardless of whether they remain in our lives. Their significance isn't measured by duration. It's measured by transformation. She had changed the way he loved. The way he listened. The way he paid attention. The way he noticed ordinary moments. That mattered. Whether or not their paths crossed again. Years later, on an ordinary evening, he watched rain slide down the living room window. There was no heartbreak left. No desperate longing. No endless replaying of old conversations. Only gratitude wrapped gently around sadness. He smiled without realizing it. Not because he wanted the past back. Because he finally understood it. There is peace that only arrives after we stop arguing with reality. If someone had asked him what love was now, his answer would have been very different. Love isn't constant excitement. It isn't endless passion. It isn't dramatic declarations made under perfect sunsets. Love is remembering, noticing, turning towards someone when they begin speaking, looking up from your phone because their story deserves your full attention, learning the language of another person's silences before they become permanent, protecting ordinary moments because one day they will become memories. Love is choosing presence long before absence teaches you its value. That may be the greatest tragedy of all. We often imagine heartbreak begins the day someone leaves. But heartbreak begins much earlier. It begins in the conversations we only half hear, in the embraces we rush through, in the small disappointments that remain unspoken because someone believes there will always be another chance. And yet, there is something quietly hopeful hidden inside that truth. Because if love is built through ordinary attention, then every ordinary day still offers another opportunity to give it. Perhaps that is the real ending of this story. Not that he lost someone extraordinary. Not that she became unforgettable because she walked away. But that her absence became the mirror through which he finally saw what love had been asking of him all along. Not perfection. Not certainty. Not grand gestures. Just to be fully there. To notice. To listen. To stay emotionally awake while life was still unfolding. Because the cruelest lesson love ever teaches is also the simplest. The people we miss most are rarely the ones who made life feel exciting. They are the ones who quietly made ordinary life feel like home. And home is something we almost never recognize. Until we're standing outside of it, looking back. There is something quietly remarkable about the way love changes us. Not while everything is going well, but after it ends. Most people assume heartbreak is only about losing another person. In reality, heartbreak often introduces us to someone we have never truly met before. Ourselves. Not the confident version we presented to the world. Not the independent version we believed ourselves to be. But the quieter person underneath. The one revealed only after there is no one left to distract us from our own thoughts. That was the person he finally met. In the beginning, he thought healing meant reaching a day when he no longer thought about her. He imagined waking up one morning and realizing she hadn't crossed his mind once. He waited for that day. Weeks passed. Months passed. Then one afternoon, something unexpected happened. He thought about her. He smiled. And then, he continued making lunch. No wave of grief. No heavy chest. No desperate need to revisit old messages. The memory had arrived. And then gently left. That was the moment he understood. Healing had never been about forgetting. It had been about no longer needing the memory to answer questions it could never answer. For a long time, he had searched for reasons. Why did she stop fighting? Why didn't she come back? Why didn't she call? Why wasn't love enough? Eventually, those questions became less important than another one. Who am I becoming because of all this? That question changed everything. Because it pointed forward instead of backward. He noticed small changes first. He became more patient with strangers. He answered his mother's phone calls instead of saying he'd call back later. He stayed after dinner when friends wanted to talk. He no longer rushed every conversation toward efficiency. Somewhere along the way, he had discovered that people rarely remember exactly what you said. They remember how fully you were there. It sounded simple. But simplicity is often the hardest lesson to live. One Saturday morning, he was sitting in a cafe when he noticed a father helping his little daughter tie her shoes. The child became frustrated. She couldn't make the loops correctly. The father didn't grab the laces from her hands. He simply stayed beside her. Patient. Encouraging. Watching. After several attempts, she finally succeeded. Her face lit up with pride. The father smiled as though she had accomplished something extraordinary. It was such a small moment. Most people would have forgotten it before finishing their coffee. He didn't. Because he understood something now that he hadn't understood years earlier. Love often looks like attention. Not interruption. Not control. Attention. The willingness to remain emotionally present while another person finds their own way. He wondered how many moments like that he had overlooked before. Probably thousands. Because ordinary life doesn't announce its significance. No music begins playing. No narrator whispers. This is one of the moments you'll remember forever. Life simply happens. Quietly. Then years later. Memory decides which ordinary moments become priceless. Sometimes he imagined what she might say if she could see him now. Not because he expected forgiveness. Not because he hoped she would return. Just because curiosity remained. Would she recognize him? Perhaps. But perhaps she wouldn't. The strange truth about heartbreak is that it changes both people. The woman who left was no longer the woman he remembered. And the man left behind wasn't the same man she had loved. People often dream about getting another chance. Yet if enough time passes, there are no longer two old people meeting again. There are two entirely new people carrying the memories of strangers they used to be. He stopped romanticizing the past. That surprised him most. For a while, memory had edited everything beautifully. Every smile looked brighter. Every conversation felt perfect. Every disagreement seemed insignificant. Eventually, he allowed himself to remember honestly. There had been misunderstandings, distance, moments of immaturity, days when neither of them knew how to reach the other. Love had existed. So had limitations. Accepting both brought him peace. Because reality is kinder than fantasy. Fantasy demands perfection. Reality simply asks for understanding. One evening, while walking home beneath a sky turning orange with sunset, he passed the apartment building where they had once lived. Without thinking, he slowed down. The windows looked different now. New curtains. Different plants on the balcony. Another family had moved in. For a brief moment, he felt strangely emotional. Not because he wished he still lived there. Because it reminded him that life never pauses. Places continue existing after we leave them. Songs continue playing. Restaurants keep serving dinner. The world gently absorbs every ending. At first that thought had frightened him. Now, it comforted him. If life could continue after loss, perhaps the heart could too. He had once believed closure was something another person gave you. A final conversation. A perfect explanation. One last apology. Now he understood something different. Closure isn't an event. It's a relationship with reality. It begins the moment we stop asking the past to become something it never was. The past cannot return. But it can still teach. That is enough. There is a quiet maturity that develops after genuine heartbreak. Not because pain automatically makes people wiser. It doesn't. Some people become harder, more suspicious, more distant. Others become softer. Not because life has become safer. Because they understand how fragile every connection truly is. He wanted to become the second kind of person. Not naive. Not careless. Simply open. Open enough to notice. Open enough to listen. Open enough to love without assuming tomorrow was guaranteed. Months turned into years. Life became beautifully ordinary again. There were deadlines. Laundry. Traffic. Birthdays. Unexpected phone calls. Rainy mornings. Coffee before work. Books left unfinished beside the bed. Nothing extraordinary. Yet somehow, everything felt different. Because he had stopped waiting for extraordinary moments to begin appreciating his life. He had learned that meaning hides inside repetition, inside familiar routines, inside conversations that seem too ordinary to remember. Those are the moments that quietly become a life. Eventually, someone new entered his world. Not dramatically. Not through some cinematic coincidence. She simply appeared through mutual friends. They talked, laughed, spent time together. For the first time in years, he noticed something unexpected. He wasn't comparing her to the past. He wasn't asking whether she could replace someone else. People are not replacements. Every person carries a different emotional language. Instead, he found himself paying attention. Really paying attention. When she spoke, he looked up. When she hesitated, he noticed. When she laughed, he stayed inside the moment instead of thinking about the next one. He wasn't trying to become perfect. He was simply trying to remain awake. Because he finally understood what inattention can quietly cost. Sometimes late at night, he still thought about her. Not every week. Not every month. Just occasionally. The memories arrived like old photographs tucked inside a drawer. You don't look at them often. But when you do, you don't wish the picture had never been taken. You're simply grateful it exists. That surprised him. Gratitude had finally become stronger than regret. He realized something beautiful. The purpose of grief had never been to punish him. It had been to expand him. Pain had slowed him down enough to notice what speed had hidden. Loss had taught him what abundance never could. Attention. Presence. Humility. The courage to say, I was wrong. The courage to ask, how are you, really? The courage to remain in uncomfortable conversations instead of escaping them. Those lessons had become part of him now. Not because someone instructed him. Because love had quietly educated him after it ended. Perhaps that is why some relationships continue changing us long after they are over. The relationship itself ends. Its influence doesn't. The people we truly love leave fingerprints on our habits, on our conversations, on the way we comfort others, on the way we notice silence, on the way we say goodbye. Sometimes, their greatest gift arrives only after they are gone. Not because absence is magical, because reflection requires distance. If someone asked him today whether losing her had been worth it, he would never answer yes. Some losses should never be romanticized. He would not choose that pain again. He would not wish it upon anyone. But he would quietly admit something else. He no longer hated what had happened. Because the ending had revealed truths that comfort never demanded he learn. And those truths had shaped the rest of his life. Looking back, he finally understood the title of the story he had unknowingly been living. Her detachment had felt more addictive than her attention. Not because emotional distance is more powerful than love. Not because mystery is more attractive than closeness. Not because people should withdraw in order to become unforgettable. None of those things are true. Her detachment became unforgettable because it illuminated everything her quiet love had been doing all along. While she was there, her care blended into the background of everyday life. After she left, its absence outlined every invisible act of love he had once overlooked. She hadn't become more valuable by leaving. He had simply become capable of seeing. And perhaps, that is the final lesson hidden beneath so many ordinary love stories. The people who transform us are rarely the loudest. They are rarely the most dramatic. Often, they are the ones who remembered the little things. Who asked if we got home safely. Who noticed when our smile looked different. Who learned our favorite coffee without being told twice. Who quietly carried pieces of our daily life until those pieces felt effortless. We almost never recognize the weight of those small acts while they are happening. Only after they disappear. Do we understand they were holding far more of our world together than we ever imagined? So if there is one thought worth carrying beyond this story, perhaps it is this. Do not wait for silence to reveal the value of someone's voice. Do not wait for absence to teach you the meaning of presence. Do not wait until memories are all that remain before deciding to pay attention. Because love rarely asks us for spectacular gestures. It asks for something much more difficult. To notice. To stay. To listen. To remain emotionally awake while another heart is trusting us with its ordinary days. In the end, the greatest relationships are not remembered because they were perfect. They are remembered because they quietly taught us how to become someone better than the person who entered them. And perhaps, that is the closest thing to forever that love ever leaves behind. If this story has been about anything, it has never really been about losing her. It has been about discovering something most people don't realize until life forces them to. The loudest lessons rarely change us. The quiet ones do. And perhaps the quietest lesson of all is this. Love rarely disappears all at once. It slowly becomes invisible. Until one day, its absence is the only thing we can clearly see. Think about the people who have mattered most in your life. Not the celebrities. Not the strangers. Not the people who briefly fascinated you. The ones who truly stayed. The ones who quietly became part of your ordinary days. When you remember them, what comes to mind? It usually isn't a grand vacation. It isn't an expensive gift. It isn't one unforgettable speech. Instead, you remember the coffee they made without asking how you liked it. The text that arrived exactly when you needed it. The way they instinctively reached for your hand while crossing the street. The laugh you could recognize from another room. The way they noticed something was wrong before you said a single word. Love leaves evidence in details, not performances. That is why people often misunderstand what they miss after someone leaves. They believe they miss excitement, adventure, chemistry. But if they look honestly, they often discover they miss something much quieter. Being known. There is enormous comfort in being deeply known by another human being. Not admired. Not idealized. Known. Someone who remembers your habits. Someone who notices your moods. Someone who understands the meaning behind your silence. That kind of intimacy is built so gradually that we almost never notice it while it is growing. It becomes part of the emotional landscape. Like the sound of rain outside your bedroom window. You stop hearing it. Until it disappears. He understood that now. There had been a time when he believed love was measured by intensity. The stronger the emotion, the stronger the relationship. Now, he measured love differently. By consistency. By attention. By emotional safety. By whether two people made each other's ordinary life feel lighter. Because excitement can begin a relationship. Only consistency allows it to become a home. One afternoon, years after everything had ended, he found himself sitting alone in a quiet park. Children were laughing somewhere nearby. An elderly man slowly fed birds from a paper bag. A woman walked past with headphones, smiling at something only she could hear. Life continued unfolding around him exactly as it always had. For a moment, he thought about how many people sitting in that park were carrying invisible stories. Someone had probably just fallen in love. Someone had probably just received heartbreaking news. Someone was likely wondering whether to leave a relationship. Someone was silently hoping another person would notice they were struggling. None of it was visible. We move through each other every day without realizing how much emotional weight people quietly carry. Perhaps that realization alone makes kindness worthwhile. He remembered something she once did that had seemed insignificant at the time. One winter evening, he had come home exhausted. Work had gone badly. He barely spoke during dinner. She didn't ask endless questions. She didn't pressure him to explain. She simply placed a cup of tea beside him before sitting down to read her own book. An hour later, he found himself talking. Not because she had convinced him, because she had made enough emotional space for him to arrive on his own. He hadn't appreciated that moment then. Now, he recognized it as one of the purest expressions of love he had ever experienced. Not fixing, not rescuing, simply making room. Perhaps that is what mature love truly becomes. Not constant advice, not endless reassurance, but emotional space. A place where another person feels safe enough to unfold naturally. That kind of safety cannot be demanded. It can only be created. Little by little. Day after day. Conversation after conversation. Until one day, someone realizes they have stopped pretending around you. And they don't even remember when it happened. There is another misconception people often carry. They believe love ends because someone stops caring. Sometimes that happens. But often, love struggles because attention slowly drifts elsewhere. Toward work. Toward stress. Toward phones. Toward endless distractions. Not because those things matter more. Because they arrive one small interruption at a time. No single distraction destroys intimacy. Thousands of unnoticed ones eventually can. Relationships are rarely lost in spectacular moments. They are usually worn away by accumulated absences. Tiny moments when one person reached, and the other person wasn't fully there. If he could speak to the younger version of himself now, he wouldn't tell him to become more romantic. He wouldn't tell him to buy more flowers or plan better vacations. Instead, he would say something surprisingly simple. Look up more often. When she starts telling you about her day, put your phone down. When she asks how you're feeling, answer honestly. When she becomes quiet, don't assume she's fine. Become curious instead of defensive. Notice the moments that seem too small to matter. Because one day, those moments will become the entire story. He smiled gently at that thought. How strange life is. We spend years searching for extraordinary experiences. Meanwhile, our greatest memories are quietly forming inside completely ordinary afternoons. There is extraordinary beauty hidden inside repetition. Inside making breakfast together. Inside grocery shopping. Inside folding laundry while talking about nothing important. Inside sitting beside someone without needing to fill every silence. These moments rarely become viral videos. No one applauds them. Yet they quietly become the emotional architecture of a shared life. By now, he no longer viewed her departure as a punishment, nor as fate, nor as proof that love inevitably fails. He saw it differently. It had been two imperfect people meeting at the limits of who they were capable of being. They loved each other as well as they knew how. And eventually, their limitations became stronger than their understanding. That truth carried sadness. But it also carried compassion. Because blame became less interesting than understanding. There is freedom inside compassion. Not because it erases responsibility. Because it releases us from endlessly dividing people into heroes and villains. Most relationships don't end because one person is entirely wrong. They end because two imperfect nervous systems slowly stop feeling emotionally safe with one another. Sometimes they find their way back. Sometimes they don't. Either way, every relationship leaves behind an education. The question is whether we allow ourselves to learn from it. That education had changed him forever. He no longer rushed through conversations. He noticed facial expressions more carefully. He apologized sooner. He asked more questions. He assumed less. He listened longer. These changes weren't dramatic. Most people probably never noticed them. But he noticed. And that was enough. Growth is often invisible from the outside. Its evidence appears in quieter reactions, in slower judgments, in softer voices, in choosing curiosity over certainty. Years later, someone asked him a simple question. What do you think love really is? He paused longer than expected. Not because he didn't know. Because there were too many true answers. Finally, he smiled. "I think love is paying attention." The other person laughed. "That's it." He nodded. "That's much harder than it sounds. Because attention requires presence. Presence requires humility. Humility requires accepting that another person's inner world is just as complex as your own. That is difficult work. Beautiful work. Lifelong work. Maybe that is why love changes us even when it doesn't last forever. Its purpose is not always permanence. Sometimes its purpose is revelation. It reveals our fears, our habits, our blind spots, our capacity for tenderness, our ability to become someone gentler than we were before. The relationship may end. The transformation doesn't have to. So if someone listening to this story is quietly grieving today, perhaps there is one final thought worth carrying with you. Do not measure your life only by who stayed. Measure it also by what each relationship taught your heart to notice. Some people teach us trust. Some teach us courage. Some teach us boundaries. Some teach us patience. And some, without ever intending to, teach us the priceless value of ordinary attention. None of those lessons are wasted, even when the relationship itself cannot continue. Because in the end, the greatest tragedy was never that she became distant. The greatest tragedy was that he understood her quiet love only after silence had replaced it. And yet, that tragedy became the beginning of wisdom. Not because suffering is beautiful, but because awareness can emerge from suffering if we allow ourselves to remain open instead of bitter. He chose openness. Again and again. Even when it felt risky. Even when there were no guarantees. Because he had learned something that could never again be forgotten. The opposite of love is not hatred. It is indifference. And love survives. Not through dramatic declarations, but through thousands of ordinary moments in which two people quietly choose to remain emotionally present with one another. So before this story ends, perhaps there is only one question left. Who in your life is quietly loving you today? In ways so ordinary that you've almost stopped noticing? Who remembers the small things? Who waits for your reply? Who asks if you made it home safely? Who notices when your smile doesn't quite reach your eyes? And just as importantly, whose quiet acts of love have you begun to treat as permanent? Because permanence is the greatest illusion love ever creates. Nothing beautiful becomes valuable only after it disappears. It was always valuable. Absence simply removes the noise that kept us from seeing it. So if there is one lesson worth carrying into tomorrow, let it be this. Don't wait for silence to teach you the sound of someone's voice. Don't wait for an empty chair to appreciate who used to sit there. Don't wait until memories become all you have before deciding to be fully present. Look up. Listen carefully. Stay curious. Protect the ordinary. Because someday, without realizing it, today will become someone's favorite memory. And perhaps, the greatest expression of love any of us can offer another human being is to make sure they never have to wonder whether we were truly there while they were giving us their ordinary days. If you've stayed with this story until now, you may have noticed something. The story began with a woman walking away. But somewhere along the journey, it quietly stopped being about her. Instead, it became the story of a man slowly waking up. Not waking up to the possibility of getting her back. Not waking up to some secret strategy that would reverse the past. He was waking up to life itself. To the parts of love he had overlooked while he was busy living inside them. And perhaps, that is where every meaningful ending truly begins. Not with another chance, but with a different pair of eyes. For years, he believed the most painful sentence in the world was, "She left." Eventually, he realized there was another sentence that carried even more weight. "I wasn't fully there while she stayed." That realization hurt. But it also freed him. Because one sentence left him powerless. The other gave him responsibility. Responsibility is painful. Yet responsibility is also where change begins. Not blame. Not shame. Responsibility. The quiet willingness to ask, what kind of person do I want to become now? There is something strangely beautiful about reaching the point where you stop trying to rewrite the past. Not because the past suddenly feels fair. Because you finally understand that every moment spent arguing with reality is a moment stolen from the life still waiting to be lived. Acceptance is often misunderstood. People imagine it means approving of what happened. It doesn't. Acceptance simply means no longer asking reality to become something else. The story happened. The ending happened. Now, what will you do with the person you have become because of it? One rainy evening, he found himself walking through the same neighborhood where they had once spent countless weekends together. The bakery was still there. The flower shop had changed owners. The bookstore had expanded into the next building. Everything looked familiar. Everything looked different. He stopped outside the small cafe where they had shared dozens of conversations. Years earlier, he wouldn't have been able to walk past without feeling a knot in his chest. This time, he simply looked through the window. Two young people were laughing over coffee. An older couple sat quietly, each reading a different book. A woman worked alone near the back with headphones on. Life had filled the empty spaces without asking permission. For a brief moment, he felt something unexpected. Not sadness. Not longing. Gratitude. Because once upon a time, he had been one of the people inside that cafe creating ordinary memories with someone he loved. Not everyone receives that gift. He smiled gently before continuing his walk. The memory no longer asked him to stay. It simply reminded him that it had existed. There is a profound difference between carrying memories and living inside them. For years, he had lived inside yesterday. Now, yesterday quietly walked beside him instead. That difference changed everything. Psychologists often speak about something called meaning reconstruction. After a significant loss, healing does not come from erasing the experience. It comes from building a new understanding of who we are because of it. At first, loss feels like destruction. Eventually, if we remain open, it becomes reconstruction. Not into the person we were before, into someone we could never have become otherwise. He understood that now. He no longer wished to return to the man he had been before heartbreak. That version of himself had loved sincerely, but not consciously. He had cared deeply, but he had often confused familiarity with permanence. He assumed tomorrow would always arrive. Now he knew better. One morning, while making breakfast, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an old friend asking if they could meet. Years ago, he might have postponed it. He was busy. There would always be another weekend. Instead, he replied immediately. Of course. Because he had learned something heartbreak teaches better than almost anything else. Later is never guaranteed. Relationships don't disappear only because people stop loving each other. Sometimes they disappear because everyone believed there would always be another opportunity. Another dinner. Another phone call. Another apology. Another conversation. Life rarely announces which ordinary moment will quietly become the last. That awareness transformed the way he lived. He hugged his parents a little longer. He answered messages more thoughtfully. He stopped multitasking while someone was speaking. He looked people in the eyes. He learned their children's names. He remembered birthdays without reminders. Not because these actions were extraordinary, because they were ordinary. And ordinary things build extraordinary relationships. Years earlier, he had searched for passion. Now, he searched for presence. Passion is powerful. Presence is dependable. Passion creates sparks. Presence keeps the fire alive through winter. Passion often asks, how do I feel? Presence quietly asks, how are you feeling? The first question keeps attention on ourselves. The second opens the door to another person's world. That simple shift changes everything. Sometimes people believe maturity means becoming emotionally detached, less vulnerable, less invested, less affected. His experience taught him the opposite. True maturity made him more willing to care, not less. Because once you understand how temporary everything is, kindness no longer feels optional. It becomes urgent, not rushed. Urgent. There is a difference. Urgency says, this matters now. Not because disaster is coming, because this moment will never exist again. One afternoon, while waiting at an airport, he watched hundreds of strangers moving through the terminal. Some were embracing after long separations. Others were saying difficult goodbyes. Children laughed. Parents worried. Business travelers hurried toward departure gates. He realized something. Every person passing him loved someone. Every person feared losing someone. Every person carried invisible hopes that no one else could see. That realization dissolved something inside him. It became much harder to judge strangers harshly once he remembered they were living stories as complicated as his own. Heartbreak had quietly expanded his empathy. Not only toward the woman he had lost, but toward humanity itself. People often ask whether time heals all wounds. He wasn't sure that was entirely true. Time alone changes very little. Time simply creates space. What heals us is what we do inside that space. Some people spend years rehearsing old arguments. Others slowly build new understanding. Time offers the opportunity. Reflection creates the healing. He had spent enough years doing both to know the difference. If someone had offered him one final conversation with her now, what would he say? Surprisingly, very little. Perhaps only this. Thank you. Not because everything had been perfect. Not because there were no mistakes. But because their time together had introduced him to lessons he would carry for the rest of his life. Sometimes gratitude becomes possible only after expectation disappears. He no longer expected another chapter. That allowed him to appreciate the chapters they had already shared. There is quiet wisdom in realizing that not every meaningful relationship is meant to last forever. Some relationships remain with us because they continue. Others remain because they change us. Neither is insignificant. A relationship should not be measured only by its duration. Some people spend decades together without truly seeing one another. Others spend only a few years together and permanently reshape each other's hearts. Length alone never determines depth. Presence does. Perhaps that is why the memories no longer frightened him. He no longer viewed them as evidence of failure. They had become evidence that he had once loved someone enough to be changed by the experience. There is dignity in that. Not everyone allows themselves to be transformed by love. Some close themselves afterward. Some decide vulnerability is too dangerous. He understood the temptation, but he chose differently. He refused to let pain become permission to stop loving wholeheartedly. Because the cost of emotional armor is almost always loneliness. So he continued living. Not perfectly. Never perfectly. There were still difficult days. Moments of impatience. Moments of fear. Moments when old habits quietly returned. Growth had never been a straight line. It was a series of gentle corrections. Again. And again. And again. Like steering a boat across a wide ocean. Tiny adjustments. Repeated consistently. Until one day, you realize you've reached an entirely different shore. And perhaps, that is where this story truly ends. Not with reunion. Not with revenge. Not with dramatic closure. But with quiet understanding. The kind that arrives after enough ordinary mornings have passed. The kind that no longer needs to prove anything. The kind that simply changes the way you greet the people still standing beside you. Because in the end, it was never really about losing her. It was about discovering what love had been trying to teach him all along. That attention is an act of love. That presence is a daily choice. That emotional safety is built one conversation at a time. That people rarely ask us for perfection. They ask us to be with them. Fully. Honestly. Consistently. If there is one final image worth leaving with you, let it be this. Imagine two people sitting together on an ordinary Tuesday evening. No celebration. No crisis. No dramatic music. One of them is talking about something that happened during the day. The other quietly puts the phone down, turns their body toward them, listens without interrupting, asks another question, smiles, stays. Nothing remarkable seems to happen. No one watching from outside would remember that evening. And yet, that may be the exact moment a lifelong memory is quietly being created. Because love almost never announces itself while it is happening. It disguises itself as ordinary life. It hides inside repeated acts of attention. Inside familiar voices. Inside everyday kindness. Inside choosing, over and over again, to remain emotionally present for another imperfect human being. Maybe that is why her detachment felt more addictive than her attention. Not because distance is stronger than love, but because distance finally revealed what attention had been silently building all along. Her love had never depended on grand declarations. It had lived in countless invisible moments. Moments he understood only after they were gone. And through that painful realization, he finally became capable of giving to others what he had once received without fully seeing. That is how love continues after endings. Not through memories alone, but through the people those memories quietly reshape. So wherever you are today, whether someone has just entered your life, or whether someone has already become a memory, perhaps the invitation is the same. Notice the ordinary. Protect the quiet moments. Say what needs to be said while there is still time to say it. Listen as though every conversation matters. Love as though familiarity is never a guarantee. Because one day, years from now, someone may look back on an ordinary afternoon with you and realize that nothing extraordinary happened. Except that, for a little while, they felt completely seen. And in the end, that may be the greatest gift one human being can ever give another. If you've listened this far, thank you. Not because this story belongs to one man, and not because it belongs to one woman, but because, in one way or another, it belongs to almost all of us. Nearly everyone reaches a moment when they realize they misunderstood love while they were living inside it. Some realize it after a breakup, some after a divorce, some after losing a parent, some after watching their children grow up too quickly, some only after attending a funeral. Life has a quiet way of revealing what mattered most only after the opportunity to take it for granted has disappeared. And perhaps that is why the simplest truths are often the hardest to learn. When this story began, it seemed to ask one question. Why does her detachment feel more addictive than her attention? Now, standing at the end, the answer feels surprisingly clear. It wasn't the distance that held him captive. It was the understanding that arrived because of the distance. Only when she stopped reaching for him did he finally see how often she had been reaching all along. Only when her voice disappeared did he notice how peaceful it had always made his ordinary days. Only when silence filled the room did he understand how much of love had been quietly happening inside conversations he barely remembered. Love had never been hiding. His attention had been elsewhere. This realization can feel painful. But perhaps it is also one of the greatest gifts adulthood offers us. Because once you truly understand this, you begin living differently. Not dramatically. Quietly. You interrupt people less. You listen longer. You say thank you more often. You stop assuming there will always be another chance. You become slower to judge. Faster to forgive. More willing to admit when you are wrong. Not because you suddenly became perfect. Because you finally understand how fragile ordinary life really is. There is an illusion almost everyone carries. We believe life is made of milestones, graduations, promotions, weddings, birthdays, vacations. The truth is, our lives are mostly made of Tuesdays, ordinary mornings, routine evenings, quick conversations before work, simple dinners, half-finished stories, shared silence, small smiles, tiny disappointments, gentle reassurances. These ordinary moments make up nearly all of our existence. The milestones are simply bookmarks. The ordinary pages are the book itself. He wished someone had told him that years earlier. He had spent so much time preparing for special occasions that he forgot to fully inhabit the ordinary ones. He believed memorable moments needed to be created. He never realized they were quietly creating themselves every single day. Every breakfast, every goodbye, every welcome home, every question asked with genuine curiosity. Every time she looked at him expecting nothing more than his attention. Those were the moments that eventually became priceless. Not because they were extraordinary, because they were repeated with love. There is something profoundly human about repetition. Children ask for the same bedtime story. Families cook the same holiday meals. Friends visit the same coffee shop. Couples develop private rituals no one else understands. We often mistake repetition for boredom. In reality, repetition is how belonging is built. The same morning kiss. The same inside joke. The same favorite seat on the couch. The same way someone says your name. The brain slowly transforms repeated moments into emotional safety. That safety becomes home. And home is rarely recognized while we're living inside it. Years after everything had ended, someone asked him if he had ever truly recovered. He thought for a while before answering. I don't think recovery means forgetting. I think recovery means remembering without wishing to change the ending. The person looked surprised. He smiled gently. There was a time when every memory hurt. Now every memory simply reminds me that I once loved someone enough to become a different person. That wasn't sadness. That was gratitude. Perhaps this is what healing actually looks like. Not becoming someone untouched by pain. Becoming someone enlarged by it. Pain can make people smaller, more fearful, more suspicious, more emotionally distant. But sometimes, if we remain willing to learn, pain quietly expands our capacity for compassion. Because once you know what loneliness feels like, you notice it more easily in others. Once you know what regret feels like, you become more careful with today's opportunities. Once you understand how easily people feel unseen, you begin looking at them differently. Heartbreak had not only changed the way he loved, it changed the way he saw humanity. He often wondered how many invisible acts of love happened around him every day. The husband quietly carrying his wife's heavy grocery bag without mentioning it. The daughter calling her father during lunch because she knew he would pretend he wasn't lonely. The teacher remembering every student's name. The nurse adjusting someone's blanket after they had fallen asleep. The friend who sends a message that simply says, I was thinking about you. None of these moments become headlines. No one applauds them. Yet they are constantly holding the world together. Love rarely changes the world through spectacle. It changes the world through ordinary people choosing kindness in moments no one else notices. Looking back, he realized that the greatest mistake he had made was never failing to love her. He had loved her. Deeply. The mistake was believing that love could exist without continual attention. Feelings begin relationships. Attention sustains them. Affection creates closeness. Presence protects it. Love is not something we simply have. It is something we repeatedly practice. Every conversation is practice. Every apology is practice. Every moment of patience is practice. Every decision to truly listen is practice. If he could leave one letter behind for anyone beginning a relationship today, it would probably be very short. It might say something like this: do not wait for anniversaries to express appreciation. Do not save tenderness for special occasions. Ask one more question than you think is necessary. Stay curious about the person beside you. Notice what has changed. Notice what has remained the same. Protect ordinary routines. Laugh often. Apologize early. Put the phone away. Look into their eyes when they are speaking. Remember that everyone wants to feel understood before they want to be advised. And never assume that because someone stayed yesterday, they will automatically feel seen tomorrow. Love is renewed through attention, not through assumption. As the years passed, he noticed something beautiful. The lessons she had unknowingly given him continued appearing in relationships she would never witness. Friends felt heard. Family members felt more appreciated. Future partners felt emotionally safer. Even strangers occasionally benefited from patience he had learned through losing her. In a strange way, her kindness continued moving through the world long after their relationship had ended. Perhaps this is how love never truly disappears. It changes hands. It becomes part of someone else's gentleness, someone else's understanding, someone else's willingness to stay present. Every healthy relationship leaves behind emotional skills that continue serving people we may never meet. Love has echoes. Sometimes they travel much farther than the relationship itself. And so, before we leave this story behind, there is one final invitation. Not a lesson, not a command, simply an invitation. Think about someone who quietly loves you. Maybe they are your partner. Maybe your mother, your father, a close friend, a grandparent, a sibling. Perhaps someone you rarely thank because their love has become familiar. Think about one ordinary thing they do. Maybe they ask whether you arrived home safely. Maybe they remember your favorite meal. Maybe they notice your mood before anyone else does. Maybe they simply sit beside you when words are unnecessary. Those moments are easy to overlook. Until one day, they become impossible to replace. So notice them now, while they are still happening. And perhaps there is another invitation as well. Become that person for someone else. Be the person who remembers. The person who listens. The person who notices. The person who asks the second question instead of ending the conversation after the first answer. The person who stays. Not because you are trying to become extraordinary. Because ordinary attention is already extraordinary. The world has enough people trying to impress one another. What it desperately needs are people willing to understand one another. Maybe that is the quiet secret hidden inside every lasting relationship. People do not stay because every day feels exciting. They stay because someone consistently makes them feel emotionally safe. They stay because they feel accepted, respected, remembered, seen. The deepest form of intimacy is not intensity. It is familiarity combined with continued curiosity. To know someone well, and still keep asking, tell me more. If this story has touched something inside you, perhaps it is because you recognized pieces of your own life within it. Maybe you remembered someone you lost. Maybe someone who is still beside you. Maybe you realized there is a conversation you need to have. An apology you have been postponing. A thank you forgot to say. Or perhaps you simply remembered to look up from your own thoughts long enough to notice another human being. If that happens, then this story has already fulfilled its purpose. Because in the end, it was never really about a man chasing a woman who had become distant. It was about something much quieter. A human being slowly discovering that the greatest expressions of love are rarely dramatic. They are found in attention, presence, consistency, curiosity, patience, the willingness to witness another person's ordinary life as though it matters. Because it does. Every ordinary day matters. Every unnoticed kindness matters. Every conversation matters. every goodbye matters. Every chance to truly see another person matters. So let this be the final thought you carry with you after this story fades into silence. One day, the people you love today will become memories. And one day, you will become a memory in someone else's life. When that day comes, they probably won't remember the expensive gifts. They won't remember every perfect word. They may not even remember every place you traveled together. But they will remember how they felt when they were with you. Whether they felt safe enough to be themselves. Whether they felt heard. Whether they felt valued. Whether your presence made ordinary days feel lighter. That is the legacy of love. Not perfection. Presence. Not intensity. Attention. Not possession. Connection. So before tomorrow arrives, look up. Listen carefully. Stay a little longer. Ask one more question. Hold someone's hand without reaching for your phone. Say thank you. Say I'm sorry. Say I love you while there is still someone there to hear it. Because the greatest tragedy is not losing someone we love. The greatest tragedy is realizing, too late, that they had been quietly giving us everything we were searching for all along. And perhaps the greatest victory is this: to learn that lesson, while there is still someone in your life waiting to be truly seen.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.